A street girl whispered, "She is behind the wall." The millionaire, incredulous, followed the voice to the forgotten library where it all began. 3 hammer blows were enough to release a sweet scent, and something that should never have been discovered. In the dimness of the room, the truth awaited, intact, suffocated, ready to change everything. Chapter 1. The Return. The iron gates of Hawthorne Manor creaked in protest as they parted for the first time in 15 years. Autumn leaves skittered across the long, neglected driveway, dancing around the wheels of Jonathan Blackwood's sleek, black sedan. The 3-story Victorian mansion loomed before him, its weathered facade a silent testament to years of abandonment. Once the crown jewel of Newport, Rhode Island's historic district, the estate now stood as a decrepit monument to what had been lost. Jonathan's knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. He had sworn never to return to this place. Not after Victoria vanished, not after the whispers and accusations, not after the investigation that led nowhere, leaving only questions that haunted his sleepless nights. Yet here he was, drawn back by the most unlikely of messengers. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Blackwood?" Detective Mark Sullivan's gravelly voice broke through the silence from the passenger seat. The veteran investigator had handled Victoria's case when it first opened 15 years ago. Though officially retired now, he had agreed to accompany Jonathan today, perhaps driven by the same unresolved questions that had plagued them both for years. "I don't know what to believe anymore, Mark." Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper, but I couldn't ignore what that child said. The child in question was Sophia Martinez, an 8-year-old girl who had been found sleeping in the groundskeeper's abandoned cottage at the edge of the property 3 days ago. When social services arrived to collect her, she had become hysterical, insisting that she couldn't leave because the lady in the library needs help. When pressed for details, the girl had described Victoria with uncanny accuracy, from her favorite sweet perfume to her passion for fruit tea. Details that no stranger, let alone a child who wasn't even born when Victoria disappeared, could possibly know. It could still be an elaborate hoax, Sullivan cautioned, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "That's why Miss Bennett is meeting us here." Jonathan referred to Emma Bennett, the social worker assigned to Sophia's case. "She'll assess the girl's state of mind while I face whatever's waiting in there." The car rolled to a stop at the foot of the grand marble staircase leading to the main entrance. As they stepped out, the biting October wind cut through Jonathan's expensive coat, a fitting welcome home for the prodigal son who had fled to the warmth of his San Francisco offices, building his tech empire while leaving the ghosts of Newport behind. A modest sedan pulled up beside them, and Emma Bennett emerged, her practical navy pantsuit and sensible shoes a stark contrast to the grandeur surrounding them. In the back seat, Jonathan could see Sophia's small face pressed against the window, her dark eyes wide with anticipation. "Mr. Blackwood," Emma extended her hand. "Thank you for agreeing to this unconventional arrangement." Jonathan shook it briefly. "Let's just get this over with." As they approached the entrance, Jonathan hesitated before inserting the key. 15 years ago, he had locked this door behind him, leaving behind the remnants of a shattered life. The key turned with surprising ease, as if the house had been waiting for his return. The foyer welcomed them with musty air and dancing dust motes, caught in the thin beams of light filtering through the closed curtains. Everything remained exactly as he had left it. The antique grandfather clock frozen at 3:17, the ornate mirror above the console table still draped with the black cloth he had placed there after her disappearance, unable to face his own reflection. "The Sioux library is this way," Jonathan said, leading them down the main hallway. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors, each one a thunderous announcement of his return. Sophia had been quietly following, clinging to Emma's hand, but as they approached the library doors, she broke free and ran ahead. "She's here! She's waiting!" The girl's voice carried an urgency that sent a chill down Jonathan's spine. The double doors to the library stood closed, untouched since that Valentine's Day night when Jonathan and Victoria had their final argument. She had refused to accompany him to an important business gala, claiming he cared more about impressing potential investors than spending time with her. The fight had ended with slammed doors and cruel words that Jonathan had replayed in his mind countless times over the years. Sullivan placed a steadying hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "You don't have to do this." But Jonathan was already reaching for the door handles. The heavy oak doors swung open to reveal the vast two-story library, once Victoria's sanctuary. Dust-covered books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, the rolling ladder still positioned where Victoria had left it that night. The plush reading chairs faced the large bay windows, overlooking what had once been her prize-winning rose garden, now overrun with weeds. Sophia darted inside, heading straight for the eastern wall where a massive bookshelf housed Victoria's collection of first-edition classics. "It's here," she whispered, pressing her small hand against the wall. "She's behind here. She's cold." Jonathan exchanged glances with Sullivan and Emma, who had followed close behind. The detective's skepticism seemed to be wavering as they watched the child's confident movements through a space she had supposedly never seen before. "How do you know about this place, Sophia?" Emma asked gently, kneeling beside the girl. "The lady told me," Sophia replied matter-of-factly. "She says her name is Victoria and she's been trapped for a very long time." Jonathan felt the floor shift beneath him. The name. They had been careful never to mention Victoria's name around the child. "What else did she tell you?" Sullivan asked, his professional curiosity evidently piqued. "She said her husband thinks she ran away, but she didn't. She said someone put her here because they were jealous." Sophia's innocent delivery of these words sent a jolt through Jonathan. "This is ridiculous," Jonathan's voice cracked, despite his attempt at dismissal. Victoria disappeared. Her clothes were missing, her personal documents gone. Even her luggage was missing. "But not her wedding ring," Sophia interjected, looking up at Jonathan with eyes too knowing for her age. "She says you found it on the nightstand the next morning, and you knew then that something was wrong because she never took it off, not even when she was angry with you." The blood drained from Jonathan's face. This detail had never been released to the public, a small but significant inconsistency that had planted the first seed of doubt in his mind about the runaway wife narrative. Sullivan stepped forward, his interest clearly heightened. "Sophia, how would someone access this wall if they wanted to?" The girl moved toward the bookshelf and pointed to a specific leather-bound volume of Pride and Prejudice, Victoria's favorite novel. "You pull this one," she said with the certainty of someone reciting memorized instructions. Before Jonathan could protest, Sullivan reached for the book and gave it a gentle tug. A barely audible click echoed through the silent library, followed by the subtle shifting of the bookshelf, which now stood slightly ajar from the wall. "My God," Emma whispered. Jonathan stared in disbelief. In all his years living in the mansion, he had never known about this secret compartment. But then the house had been in Victoria's family for generations before their marriage. There were bound to be secrets he wasn't privy to. Sullivan pulled the bookshelf further, revealing a narrow passageway behind it. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it the faint, unmistakable scent of sweet perfume, Victoria's signature fragrance. "Impossible," Jonathan breathed. Sophia slipped her small hand into Jonathan's larger one, her touch anchoring him as the ground seemed to sway beneath his feet. "She's waiting for you," the child whispered, gently tugging him toward the darkness beyond. As Jonathan took his first hesitant step toward the passage, a cascade of memories flooded his mind. Victoria's laughter echoing through these very halls, the way her eyes lit up when she spoke of her beloved books, the softness of her hand in his on their wedding day. Had she really been here all along, somewhere within the walls of the home he had abandoned? Sullivan produced a flashlight from his coat pocket, its beam cutting through the darkness ahead. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his professional demeanor returning as he took the lead. The beam of light illuminated a narrow stone staircase spiraling downward, the air growing colder with each step they descended. Jonathan followed, with Sophia still clutching his hand and Emma close behind them. Chapter 2. Whispers Beyond the Wall. The stone steps descended into darkness, each footfall echoing against the damp walls. Jonathan felt as though he were walking into the depths of his own conscience. Every step carrying him further into the past, he had tried desperately to escape. Sophia's small hand remained firmly clasped in his, her presence both comforting and unsettling. Sullivan's flashlight beam danced across the stone walls, revealing centuries-old masonry that predated even the mansion's Victorian reconstruction. "This must have been part of the original foundation," the detective murmured, his voice bouncing off the narrow passage. "Revolutionary War era, if I had to guess." After 20 steps, the staircase opened into a small chamber, no larger than a modest bedroom. Sullivan swept his light around the space, illuminating what appeared to be a makeshift living area. A narrow cot stood against one wall, neatly made with blankets that showed no signs of 15 years' abandonment. A small bookshelf contained a dozen or so volumes, all titles Jonathan recognized as Victoria's favorites. A writing desk occupied the corner, its surface cluttered with journals and scattered papers. "Someone's been down here," Emma whispered, her professional composure momentarily fractured by the discovery. "And recently?" Sullivan nodded grimly. "The dust patterns suggest regular movement." He directed his flashlight toward the floor, where clear pathways cut through the otherwise undisturbed dust. Jonathan's attention, however, was drawn to a framed photograph on the desk, a wedding picture showing him and Victoria on the happiest day of their lives. He picked it up with trembling hands, wiping away a thin film of dust from the glass. "This was from our bedroom." "Look," Sophia's excited voice broke the tense silence as she pointed toward another door on the far side of the chamber. Unlike the rough stonework surrounding it, this door was modern, its metal surface incongruent with the ancient walls. Sullivan approached it cautiously, inspecting the electronic keypad mounted beside it. "It's a secure room," he said. "Requires a code to enter. Try 0214, Sophia suggested. Jonathan looked at her in astonishment. "February 14th, Valentine's Day. The day of your last fight," Sullivan added quietly. Emma placed a gentle hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Sweetheart, how could you possibly know that?" The girl's response was simple, delivered with the unshakable certainty of childhood. "The lady told me. She says it's important that you remember that day." With a deep breath, Jonathan stepped forward and entered the code. The keypad emitted a soft beep, followed by the distinct click of a lock disengaging. Sullivan positioned himself in front, one hand instinctively reaching toward the weapon he no longer carried in retirement, old habits resurfacing in the face of the unknown. The door swung open with surprising ease, releasing a rush of cool, sterile air. The detective's flashlight revealed a space that stood in stark contrast to the rustic chamber they had just passed through. A fully equipped medical room with monitoring equipment, an IV stand, and at its center, a hospital bed surrounded by softly humming machines. And on the bed, lying perfectly still beneath crisp white sheets, was Victoria Blackwood. Jonathan froze in the doorway, his vision tunneling until all he could see was his wife's face, older, thinner, but unmistakably her. Her chestnut hair, now streaked with silver, framed a face that seemed frozen in time despite the evident passage of years. Clear tubes ran from her arms to the various machines surrounding her, and a steady beeping confirmed what seemed impossible. Victoria was alive. "My God," Jonathan whispered, stumbling forward. "Victoria." There was no response. Her eyes remained closed, her breathing shallow but regular. "She's in a coma," a voice announced from behind them. They all turned to find a woman standing at the entrance to the chamber, silhouetted against the dim light from the stairwell. As she stepped forward, Sullivan's flashlight illuminated her features, a face similar enough to Jonathan's to mark them as siblings. "Eleanor," Jonathan breathed, recognition and confusion warring in his voice. "What have you done?" Eleanor Blackwood stepped fully into the room, her posture rigid, her expression carefully composed. At 52, she retained the aristocratic bearing that had always distinguished the Blackwood family, though the years had etched deep lines around her eyes and mouth. "What I had to do," she replied simply. "For Victoria's sake, for your sake, though you never understood that." Emma instinctively pulled Sophia closer, shielding the child as the family drama unfolded. Sullivan moved to position himself between Eleanor and the others, his training evident in his stance despite the years of retirement. "She's been here all this time?" Jonathan's voice cracked as 15 years of grief, confusion, and misdirected anger crashed over him. "While I believed she had abandoned me? While the entire town whispered that I had something to do with her disappearance?" Eleanor's cool facade showed its first crack. "You were never supposed to come back," she said. "You were supposed to move on with your life. That was the plan." "The plan?" Jonathan echoed incredulously. "You made me believe my wife had left me. She was going to leave you anyway." Eleanor's voice rose sharply. "That night, after your fight, she called me. She was hysterical, saying she couldn't do this anymore, that she was packing her bags and leaving Newport for good." Sullivan stepped forward. "Miss Blackwood, I think you should know that interfering with an investigation by concealing information is—" "There is no investigation anymore, Detective," Eleanor cut him off. "You closed Victoria's case years ago. Missing person, presumed voluntary departure." "Because we were led to believe she left willingly," Sullivan countered, his professional demeanor hardening. "But I'm looking at evidence that suggests something entirely different." Jonathan barely registered their exchange, his attention fixed on Victoria's still form. He approached the bed cautiously, as if afraid she might disappear if he moved too quickly. Up close, the changes in her were more apparent, the slight hollowing of her cheeks, the paleness of her skin, the way her once vibrant presence had diminished to this quiet shadow. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Eleanor's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of 15 years of secrecy visibly pressing upon her. "She was leaving the house that night after your fight. I came over to try to talk some sense into her. We argued at the top of the library stairs. She was so angry, so determined to leave you." Emma gasped softly, piecing together what must have happened next. "She fell," Eleanor continued, her voice now flat, emotionless. "She stumbled backward and fell down the entire flight of stairs. I found her unconscious at the bottom. There was so much blood." "And you didn't call an ambulance?" Sullivan asked incredulously. Eleanor lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm a doctor. I assessed her condition and realized the head trauma was severe. By the time an ambulance would have arrived from the mainland, it might have been too late, so I made a choice." "You brought her down here," Jonathan said, the pieces finally falling into place. "To this makeshift medical facility." "This makeshift facility saved her life," Eleanor retorted. "I had been renovating this space as a potential clinic for my research into experimental treatments for coma patients. The renovation was nearly complete when Victoria had her accident." "So you just decided to keep her here? For 15 years? Sullivan's disbelief was palpable. "Without informing her husband or the authorities?" Eleanor turned to Jonathan, her expression softening slightly. "You were falling apart, Jonathan. The business was on the verge of collapse. If you had known she was in a coma with little chance of recovery, you would have thrown away everything to sit by her side, waiting for a miracle that medical science suggested would never come." "That wasn't your decision to make," Jonathan's voice broke. "I made the best choice I could under impossible circumstances," Eleanor insisted. "I created a narrative that would let you move on. And it worked, didn't it? You rebuilt your life in California. Your company is now worth billions. You've accomplished everything you ever wanted." "Except having my wife," Jonathan countered, bitterly. Sophia, who had been observing silently from Emma's protective embrace, suddenly stepped forward. "The lady says she understands," she announced, her young voice cutting through the tension. "She says she's not angry anymore." All eyes turned to the child, who walked confidently to Victoria's bedside and placed her small hand over the woman's limp one. "How is this possible?" Emma asked softly. "Sophia, how can you know what Victoria is thinking?" "I just hear her," Sophia replied simply. "Not with my ears in here." She tapped her temple. "She's been talking to me since I found the cottage. She guided me here." Eleanor's scientific mind visibly struggled with this inexplicable element. "That's impossible. Victoria's brain activity has been minimal for years." She's not capable of conscious thought, let alone communication. But Jonathan remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell about the Blackwood women. Stories of inexplicable connections, of psychic bonds that defied rational explanation. Stories he had dismissed as superstitious nonsense. What else? "Does she say, Sophia?" he asked, kneeling beside the child. Sophia closed her eyes as if listening intently to a voice only she could hear. "She says the music box opens with the melody of your first dance." The child's brow furrowed in concentration. "She says it's important. There's something inside you need to see." Jonathan's breath caught. On Victoria's nightstand stood a small, silver music box, a wedding gift from him that she had treasured. He had assumed it had disappeared along with her other personal items. Now he realized Eleanor must have brought it down here as part of the staged scene of Victoria's departure. He reached for it with trembling hands, turning the delicate key until the familiar notes of La Vie en Rose began to play. As the melody reached its chorus, he pressed the hidden catch that Victoria had accidentally discovered during their first year of marriage. A secret compartment that even the craftsman who made it hadn't known existed. The false bottom slid open, revealing a folded piece of paper that had yellowed slightly with age. Jonathan unfolded it carefully, revealing Victoria's elegant handwriting. Chapter 3. Paper Trails. Jonathan's hands trembled as he unfolded the yellowed paper. Victoria's handwriting flowed across the page, the familiar, elegant script transporting him instantly back to simpler times. Mornings when he would find her thoughtful notes tucked into his briefcase. Evenings when her shopping lists would include his favorite desserts with little hearts drawn beside them. "What does it say?" Sullivan asked, his investigator's instincts clearly piqued. Jonathan cleared his throat, struggling to steady his voice as he began to read aloud. "My dearest Jonathan, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. I'm writing this after our fight, and I realize I've been unfair. You were right. I've been keeping secrets, but not the kind you imagine. I've discovered something about your business partner that frightens me. Robert isn't who he claims to be. The documents are in the safe behind grandmother's portrait. Combination: the day we met, the day we married, the day we promised forever. I love you always, Victoria." The room fell silent as the implications of Victoria's words settled over them. Even Eleanor seemed genuinely surprised, her carefully constructed narrative beginning to unravel. "Robert Miller?" Sullivan asked, recalling the name of Jonathan's former partner who had mysteriously withdrawn from their company shortly after Victoria's disappearance. What could she have discovered about him? Jonathan's mind raced through possibilities. Robert had been more than a business partner. He'd been a friend, a confidant, almost like the brother Jonathan had never had. He'd been devastated when Robert suddenly sold his shares and cut all contact, explaining via a terse email that he needed to pursue other opportunities. "I don't know," Jonathan admitted. "But if Victoria thought it was important enough to hide this note..." He turned to Eleanor. "Did you know about this?" Eleanor shook her head. "I found the music box among her things that night, but I never knew about any secret compartment. I brought it down here because it seemed important to her." Sophia tugged gently at Jonathan's sleeve. "The lady says you need to find the safe now. She says it's urgent." "The portrait is in my office," Jonathan said. "Upstairs, at the end of the east wing." Sullivan nodded. "I think we should take a look at those documents." Emma stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Sophia's shoulder. "Perhaps I should stay here with Sophia and Ms. Blackwood while you gentlemen investigate?" The social worker's professional tone barely masked her underlying message. She didn't entirely trust Eleanor and wouldn't leave the child alone with her. Sullivan caught her meaning and nodded almost imperceptibly. "That seems wise," he agreed. "We won't be long." As Jonathan reluctantly prepared to leave Victoria's side, Eleanor moved toward the medical equipment, checking readings and making small adjustments. "Her vitals are stable," she reported clinically. "They always are. For 15 years, she's remained in this persistent vegetative state, breathing on her own, heart beating steadily, but no meaningful brain activity. Yet somehow she's communicating with Sophia, Jonathan pointed out. Eleanor's expression remained skeptical. There must be a rational explanation. The lady says there are many things science can't explain yet, Sophia interjected, with the simple confidence of a child repeating an obvious truth. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Eleanor's face before she composed herself. I'll stay with Victoria and monitor her condition. You should go find those documents. Jonathan hesitated, torn between not wanting to leave Victoria and needing to discover what she had found so concerning 15 years ago. I'll be back. Soon? He whispered, gently touching his wife's hand before following Sullivan toward the stairs. The two men retraced their steps up to the library in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The ornate library seemed different now, transformed by the knowledge of what lay beneath it. Jonathan led the way through the mansion's grand hallways, past dust-covered furniture and shrouded paintings, until they reached the double doors of his former office. Unlike the rest of the house, this room showed signs of recent entry. A thin layer of dust covered most surfaces, but there were clear handprints on the desk and disturbances in the dust on several shelves. Someone's been in here, Sullivan observed, instantly alert. Recently. Jonathan moved directly to the far wall where a life-sized portrait of his grandmother, Evelyn Blackwood, hung in a gilded frame. The formidable matriarch gazed sternly from the canvas, her sharp eyes seeming to follow them as they approached. "Help me with this," Jonathan said, grasping one edge of the heavy frame. Together, they lifted the portrait from its hooks, revealing a wall safe concealed behind it. Jonathan stared at the dial, mentally calculating the combination. "The day we met," he murmured, turning the dial to 10:08:05. "The day we married." Another turn to a second sequence, 06:12:06. "The day we promised forever." A final sequence, 02:14:08. Valentine's Day, 2 years into their marriage, when they had renewed their vows during a private ceremony on the beach below the mansion. The safe door swung open with a satisfying click. Inside lay a sealed manila envelope, the words "Evidence RM" written across it in Victoria's handwriting. Sullivan whistled softly. Your wife was playing detective. Jonathan removed the envelope carefully and opened it. Inside were photographs, financial statements, and what appeared to be printouts of news articles from various small-town newspapers across the country. As they spread the contents across Jonathan's desk, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. "These are identity records," Sullivan said, examining the papers with a professional eye. "Birth certificates, social security numbers, driver's licenses, all for different men spanning about 20 years. Jonathan picked up a photo that showed Robert, the man he had known as his friend and business partner, standing beside a different woman and children in front of a suburban home. The timestamp indicated it had been taken 3 years before Robert had supposedly moved to Newport as a single man with no family ties. He was living multiple lives, Jonathan realized, the betrayal cutting deep even after 15 years. But why would Victoria care enough to investigate him? Sullivan pointed to a newspaper clipping. This might explain it. Apparently one of his previous families reported him missing after he disappeared with their life savings. The woman was left destitute with 3 young children. Victoria would have been outraged, Jonathan said softly, memories of his wife's fierce sense of justice flooding back. She was always so protective of women and children. She ran that shelter downtown, remember? The detective nodded grimly. And if she confronted him about it? Jonathan's blood ran cold at the implication. You think Robert had something to do with her accident? I think it's worth considering, Sullivan replied cautiously. We have a man with a history of assuming false identities and defrauding people who suddenly leaves town immediately after your wife disappears. Now we discover she had been investigating him. That's a connection that deserves scrutiny. Jonathan sifted through more documents, finding financial records that showed large transfers from company accounts to offshore banks, transactions that would have required both his and Robert's authorization. Except Jonathan had never signed off on these transfers. He forged my signature, Jonathan realized, examining the documents more closely. He was embezzling from the company. And Victoria discovered it, Sullivan concluded. The question is, what happened after she wrote that note? Did she confront him directly, or did she speak with someone else first? Eleanor, Jonathan said, the pieces clicking into place. Victoria called Eleanor that night after our fight. What if she wasn't just upset about our argument? What if she told Eleanor about Robert's fraud? Sullivan frowned thoughtfully. That would add another layer to this situation. If Eleanor knew about the embezzlement... Before he could complete the thought, they heard footsteps in the hallway. 2, heavy to be Emma's or Sophia's. Both men turned as the office door swung open. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit stood in the doorway, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, his posture radiating confidence despite the unexpected confrontation. Jonathan recognized him immediately, though 15 years had added weight to his frame and lines to his once smooth face. "Hello, Jonathan," Robert Miller said calmly. "I was told you might be visiting the old place today." Sullivan instinctively stepped forward, positioning himself between Jonathan and the newcomer. "Robert Miller, I presume?" Robert smiled thinly, his gaze flicking to the documents spread across the desk. "I see you found Victoria's little collection. She always was too curious for her own good." "How did you know I'd be here?" Jonathan demanded, anger rising in his chest. "Eleanor called me," Robert replied simply. "We've stayed in touch over the years. Someone had to help her maintain this place and care for Victoria's medical needs. Those experimental treatments don't come cheap, you know." Jonathan felt as though he'd been struck. "You knew? All this time you knew Victoria was here?" Robert shrugged. "Of course. Eleanor needed an ally, and I needed certain assurances. Mutually beneficial arrangements are the cornerstone of good business, as you well know." Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "What kind of assurances?" "That my past indiscretions would remain private," Robert answered smoothly. "Nothing sinister, Detective Sullivan. Just the understanding that certain documents would never find their way to the authorities." "You were stealing from the company," Jonathan accused, "using fake identities, abandoning families across the country." Robert's expression hardened. "Slightly. I prefer to think of it as creating opportunities. Besides, the statute of limitations has long expired on those particular activities." "Not on all of them," Sullivan countered, "and interfering with an investigation has no limitations." Robert laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "What investigation? Victoria Blackwood's case was closed years ago. She was declared legally absent, presumed to have abandoned her husband and her responsibilities. That's the official record." "Records can be amended," Sullivan said firmly. "Perhaps," Robert conceded, "but at what cost? Consider carefully what you're about to unleash, Jonathan. Victoria has received state-of-the-art care for 15 years, care that would have been impossible in a conventional hospital, care that was funded in part by the arrangement Eleanor and I made." "What arrangement?" Jonathan demanded. "Your sister is brilliant, you know," Robert said, his tone almost admiring. "Her research into coma recovery is groundbreaking, but such research requires funding. Funding that traditional grant committees deem too experimental, too risky. I simply helped redirect some of our company's more flexible resources toward her work." "You stole company money to fund Eleanor's research," Jonathan translated bluntly. Robert spread his hands in a gesture of mock innocence. "I prefer to think of it as unauthorized reallocation of assets for humanitarian purposes. Your company survived and thrived. Eleanor got to continue her research. Victoria received care that kept her alive. Everyone benefited." "Except for the truth," Sullivan interjected, "and justice." "Such lofty concepts," Robert scoffed, "but ultimately impractical in the real world, where difficult choices must be made." Jonathan stared at the man he had once considered a friend, seeing him clearly. "For the first time. Did you push her? That night when she fell, was it really an accident?" Something flickered in Robert's eyes, surprise perhaps, or calculation. "I wasn't even there that night. Ask your sister if you don't believe me. Victoria's fall was a tragic accident, one that Eleanor witnessed firsthand." Then why hide it? Sullivan pressed. Why create this elaborate deception? Robert's smile returned, confident and condescending. That was Eleanor's decision. I merely helped facilitate the arrangement. She believed it was better for everyone, especially Jonathan, if Victoria was thought to have left willingly. Given Jonathan's subsequent success, it seems she was right. Success built on lies, Jonathan said bitterly. Chapter 4. Tangled. Perhaps we should all discuss this together, Robert said smoothly, gesturing toward the door. Eleanor will want to explain her side of things. After all, she's the one who's dedicated 15 years of her life to caring for your wife. Jonathan gathered Victoria's documents and tucked them back into the envelope, unwilling to let them out of his possession. Now that he'd finally discovered them, Sullivan remained vigilant, his eyes never leaving Robert as they moved through the mansion's dusty corridors back toward the library. Does the girl really claim to communicate with Victoria? Robert asked casually as they walked. Fascinating. If true, Eleanor mentioned something about it when she called me. Sophia seems to know things she couldn't possibly know otherwise, Sullivan replied non-committally. Robert's expression remained skeptical. Children have vivid imaginations, and information has ways of leaking, even unintentionally. They reached the library, where the secret passage still stood open. As they descended the stone staircase, Jonathan's mind raced with questions. The Victoria he'd known had been intuitive, observant. She would have noticed if something was amiss with Robert. Had she confronted him directly, or had she gone straight to Eleanor with her suspicions? When they reached the medical room, they found Eleanor checking Victoria's vital signs, while Emma sat with Sophia on a small sofa in the corner. The social worker rose immediately when they entered, her professional demeanor unable to mask her concern. Mr. Miller, she acknowledged with obvious surprise. I wasn't aware you were involved in this situation. Robert has apparently been Eleanor's accomplice all these years, Jonathan said, before Robert could respond, unable to keep the bitterness from his voice. They've been working together to keep Victoria hidden while embezzling from my company to fund Eleanor's research. Eleanor flinched at the accusation, but didn't deny it. It wasn't like that, Jonathan. Not entirely. Then explain it to me, Jonathan demanded. Explain how my sister and my business partner conspired to hide my wife from me for 15 years while stealing from the company we built together. Eleanor's professional composure cracked, revealing the weight of years of secrecy. It started as a genuine emergency response. When Victoria fell, I made a split-second medical decision to treat her here, rather than risk moving her. Her head trauma was severe. Every minute counted. But after the emergency passed, Sullivan prompted, why maintain the deception? Eleanor moved away from Victoria's bedside, pacing the small room as she gathered her thoughts. The first 48 hours were critical. Victoria remained unconscious, her condition precarious. I couldn't leave her, not even to explain to you what had happened. She looked directly at Jonathan. You were out of town for those 2 days after your fight, remember? At that conference in Chicago. Jonathan nodded. He'd flown out early the morning after their argument, still angry, expecting Victoria would cool down while he was gone. By the time you returned, Eleanor continued, the situation had changed. Victoria had stabilized physically, but brain scans showed significant damage. The prognosis was, she hesitated, not promising. The medical consensus would have been to transfer her to a long-term care facility, where she'd receive standard but minimal treatment for what most neurologists would consider a permanent vegetative state. But you didn't believe that diagnosis, Sullivan guessed, studying Eleanor's expression. I've dedicated my career to challenging the conventional wisdom about consciousness in coma patients, Eleanor confirmed. My research suggests that many patients diagnosed as vegetative actually retain higher levels of awareness than we can detect with standard methods. But my experimental treatments weren't approved for clinical use. No hospital would have allowed me to try them on Victoria. So you kept her here, Jonathan said, in your private laboratory. Eleanor nodded. I convinced myself it was for her benefit, that I could provide better, more innovative care than any conventional facility, And there have been promising signs over the years, subtle responses to stimuli that wouldn't be noticed in a traditional setting where nurses are overworked and doctors spend minutes, not hours, with each patient. Robert stepped forward. When Eleanor explained the situation to me, I saw an opportunity to help. Your company had funds that weren't being utilized efficiently. Eleanor's research needed financing. It seemed like a simple solution. That doesn't explain why you kept me in the dark, Jonathan countered, his voice rising. Why make me believe my wife had abandoned me? A flash of guilt crossed Eleanor's face. That was my decision, not Robert's. I saw how devastated you were after the fight, how you blamed yourself for driving her away. I thought, knowing the truth would destroy you, that you'd put your life on hold waiting for a recovery that might never come. So you lied to me, Jonathan said flatly. For 15 years. I protected you, Eleanor insisted, and I protected Victoria. The experimental treatments I've developed have kept her brain from deteriorating further. There's still hope for recovery, even after all this time. Sullivan frowned. But the deception went beyond just hiding Victoria's condition. You deliberately created evidence of her voluntary departure, packed clothes, missing documents. That was my contribution, Robert admitted without apparent remorse. Eleanor needed to make Jonathan believe Victoria had left willingly. I simply helped make the scenario more convincing. By stealing from our company to finance it all, Jonathan added bitterly. Robert shrugged. The company prospered despite, or perhaps because of, my financial management. You became a billionaire, Jonathan. Would that have happened if you'd spent the last 15 years sitting beside a hospital bed, watching your wife's unchanging face? Before Jonathan could respond, Sophia spoke up from her place beside Emma. The lady doesn't like when you talk about her like she's not here, the child said firmly. She says she can hear everything. All eyes turned to the small girl, whose expression held a certainty that none of the adults in the room could dismiss entirely. That's impossible, Eleanor said, though her scientific conviction seemed slightly shaken. Victoria's EEG shows minimal brain activity consistent with a persistent vegetative state. Maybe your machines don't see everything, Sophia replied simply. Robert studied the child with calculating interest. Fascinating. The power of suggestion, perhaps? Or maybe, he glanced at Eleanor. Maybe there's something to your theories about consciousness after all, Doctor. Eleanor moved to check the monitoring equipment again, her brow furrowed in concentration. There have been anomalies in her readings recently, small spikes in activity that don't follow the usual patterns. I assumed they were equipment malfunctions. Or signs that she's trying to communicate, Jonathan suggested, hope flaring for the first time since entering this hidden chamber. Sophia approached Victoria's bedside again, placing her small hand over the older woman's. She wants to wake up, the child said softly. She's been trying for a long time, but it's like being trapped in quicksand. The more she struggles, the deeper she sinks. Eleanor's scientific skepticism warred visibly with her desperate hope for her research to be vindicated. If there is increased neural activity, it could be a response to the experimental treatment protocol I started 3 months ago, a new compound designed to stimulate neurogenesis in damaged brain tissue. Sullivan moved closer to Victoria's bedside. If she's been aware all this time. The implication hung heavy in the air. Victoria, potentially conscious but unable to move or communicate, trapped within her own body for 15 years while the people around her made decisions about her life without her consent. I never would have. Eleanor began, then stopped, visibly shaken by the possibility. All my research suggested that patients in her condition weren't conscious in the way we understand consciousness, that they experienced nothing. The lady says she remembers fragments, Sophia continued, her young voice taking on an oddly mature cadence, like dreams that come and go. Sometimes she could hear voices but couldn't understand the words. Sometimes she felt touches but couldn't respond. It was like being underwater, everything muffled and distant. Jonathan knelt beside Sophia, bringing himself to eye level with the child. How did you find her, Sophia? How did you know to come here? The girl's expression grew thoughtful. I started hearing her about a month ago, just whispers at first, like someone calling from very far away. Then the whispers got clearer. She told me where to find the cottage on your property, said I'd be safe there. When I came, her voice got stronger. She guided me to the main house and told me to find help, to tell someone she was trapped behind the wall in the library. Emma placed a gentle hand on Sophia's shoulder. Sophia has always been highly intuitive, the social worker explained carefully. In the foster system, she would sometimes know things about other children or staff that she couldn't possibly have known. Her previous foster families found it unsettling. Which is why she kept running away, Jonathan realized. Until she found her way here. Robert cleared his throat. This is all very touching, but it doesn't change the practical realities we're facing. Victoria's condition, while perhaps more complex than we understood, remains essentially the same. She requires specialized care that only Eleanor has been providing. Care funded by stolen money, Sullivan reminded him sharply. Details, Robert dismissed with a wave of his hand. The important question now is, what happens next? Do we disrupt the system that has kept Victoria alive and receiving cutting-edge treatment for 15 years? Or do we find a way to move forward that serves everyone's interests? Jonathan stood, facing Robert squarely. This isn't a business negotiation. This is my wife's life. My life. 15 years stolen from us. No one stole anything, Eleanor interjected. I've dedicated every day to Victoria's care, to developing treatments that might someday help her recover, while lying to me, Jonathan countered, while letting me believe she had abandoned our marriage. Because it was easier for you to hate her than to watch her waste away. Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. Don't you understand? I was trying to protect both of you. Victoria from being warehoused in some facility where no one would notice the subtle signs of consciousness I've been documenting for years. And you from the helpless agony of watching the woman you love, trapped in an unresponsive body with no guarantee of recovery. The room fell silent after Eleanor's outburst, the only sound the steady beeping of Victoria's monitors. Jonathan stared at his sister, seeing for the first time the toll the past 15 years had taken on her as well, the deep lines around her eyes, the premature grey in her hair, the exhaustion that seemed bone deep. I appreciate what you've done for Victoria, he said finally, his voice softened but still firm. But the deception ends now. No more secrets, no more lies. Robert stepped forward, his expression calculating. Be reasonable, Jonathan. If this becomes public, the scandal would devastate your company's stock value. Eleanor's research would be discredited before it could help others, and Victoria would become a media spectacle. Is that what you want for her? What I want, Jonathan replied evenly, is the truth. All of it. Starting with exactly what happened the night Victoria fell, all eyes turned to Eleanor, whose face had gone pale. I've told you what happened. We argued at the top of the stairs. She lost her balance and fell. What were you arguing about? Sullivan pressed, his investigator's instincts clearly detecting something amiss in Eleanor's account. Eleanor hesitated, glancing briefly at Robert before answering. Victoria had discovered some financial irregularities in the company records. She suspected Robert was embezzling funds and came to me because she knew I handled some of the company's medical research investments. Robert's smooth facade cracked slightly. That's not entirely accurate, Eleanor. No? Eleanor challenged, an edge entering her voice. Should I tell them what really happened that night, Robert? About how you arrived at the house during my argument with Victoria? About how you tried to convince her that the financial discrepancies were simple accounting errors? Jonathan looked between his sister and his former business partner, seeing the tension crackling between them. What aren't you telling us, Eleanor? Before she could answer, a new sound filled the room, a soft beeping alarm from one of Victoria's monitors. Eleanor immediately switched back to doctor mode, moving quickly to check the readings. Her neural activity is spiking, she reported, professional focus overriding the emotional tension of moments before. This is unusual, far beyond the patterns I've observed previously. Sophia squeezed Victoria's hand. "She's trying really hard to reach us," the child said. "She says it's important that we know the whole truth." Eleanor adjusted several settings on the monitoring equipment, her expression a mix of scientific curiosity and growing concern. These readings suggest significantly increased brain activity, particularly in regions associated with conscious thought and memory recall. "Is that dangerous for her?" Jonathan asked anxiously. "Not dangerous necessarily," Eleanor replied, still focused on the monitors, "but definitely unusual. It's as if she's fighting to wake up," Sophia finished for her. Chapter 5: Awakening Truths. A tense silence filled the room as they all watched Victoria's monitors, the increased beeping creating an urgent soundtrack to the unfolding drama. Eleanor moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs and adjusting medication levels, while the others stood helplessly by, uncertain what they were witnessing. "What can we do?" Jonathan asked, his voice strained with the weight of 15 years of absence compressed into this critical moment. "There's nothing to do but wait," Eleanor replied, her clinical detachment returning as she worked. "These neural patterns are unprecedented in Victoria's case. I need to monitor how they develop." Sophia hadn't released Victoria's hand, and now the child's face was scrunched in intense concentration. "She's trying really hard," the girl reported. "It's like pushing through a really thick wall." Robert remained near the door, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished as he observed the unexpected medical development. Sullivan positioned himself strategically between Robert and the exit, his law enforcement instincts clearly on alert, despite his retired status. Emma moved closer to Sophia, her protective instincts engaged. "Is this tiring for you, sweetheart?" she asked gently. "You've been through a lot today." The girl shook her head without opening her eyes. "I'm okay. The lady needs me." Suddenly, the steady rhythm of Victoria's breathing changed. A small gasp escaped her lips, the first voluntary sound she had made in 15 years. Eleanor's eyes widened as she leaned forward, her professional reserve momentarily forgotten. "Victoria, can you hear me?" Another sound, barely audible, but unmistakably an attempt at speech. Jonathan moved to the other side of the bed, taking his wife's free hand in his own. "Victoria, it's Jonathan. I'm here. We're all here." Victoria's eyelids fluttered, the movement slight but distinct. Eleanor quickly adjusted the bed to elevate Victoria's head slightly, then dimmed the lights in the room. "Don't rush her," the doctor instructed. This long sensory input could be overwhelming. Over the next several minutes, they watched in awe as Victoria struggled toward consciousness. Her fingers twitched in Jonathan's grasp. Her breathing pattern became more irregular, signs of the immense effort she was making to break through the barriers of her condition. Finally, her eyes opened, just a crack at first, then wider as they adjusted to the dim light of the room. They moved slowly, unfocused at first, then gradually settling on Sophia's face. "Hi," the child said simply, with the straightforward greeting only a child would offer in such a momentous moment. Victoria's lips moved, forming what might have been an attempt at a smile. Her gaze shifted, taking in the others around her bed, lingering on Jonathan's face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Don't try to speak yet," Eleanor advised, her clinical voice belied by the tears gathering in her eyes. "Oh, your vocal cords haven't been used in a long time." But Victoria seemed determined. Her lips moved again, and this time a raspy whisper emerged. "John, than." "I'm here," he assured her, tears streaming freely down his face now. "I'm right here." Victoria's eyes moved to Eleanor, then to Robert, still hovering near the doorway. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, certainly, but also something harder to define. Fear, perhaps, or anger. "Remarkable," Eleanor murmured, checking Victoria's vital signs again. "I've never seen recovery like this in any of my research cases. The neural pathways should have atrophied beyond repair after so many years." "The lady is very strong," Sophia stated matter-of-factly. "She's been practicing for a long time, trying to move just a little bit more each day." Victoria's eyes returned to the child, a question in them that she couldn't yet verbalize. I'm Sophia, the girl introduced herself. I've been hearing you for a while now. I told them you were trapped behind the wall, just like you asked me to. Victoria managed another whisper. Thank you. Sullivan stepped closer to the bed, his weathered face showing the wonder of the moment despite his professional reserve. Mrs. Blackwood, I don't want to overwhelm you, but do you remember what happened the night you were injured? Eleanor shot him a warning look. Detective, this isn't the time for questioning. Victoria needs rest and medical evaluation. Her condition remains extremely fragile. But Victoria's eyes had sharpened at Sullivan's question. With visible effort, she turned her gaze toward Robert, who had gone very still. Her next whisper was barely audible, but the single word carried clearly in the hushed room. Him. All eyes turned to Robert, whose practiced composure finally crumbled completely. She's confused, he said quickly. Memory impairment is common in cases like hers. Eleanor, you should sedate her before she overexerts herself. No. The word came from Jonathan, firm and unyielding. No more controlling Victoria's narrative. No more decisions made without her consent. Eleanor hesitated, torn between her medical instincts and the dawning realization that the carefully constructed reality she'd maintained for 15 years was unraveling before her eyes. Victoria's fingers tightened around Jonathan's hand with surprising strength. She drew a deeper breath and managed a full sentence, each word a victory over her long silence. He pushed me, after I threatened to expose him. The accusation hung in the air, undeniable despite Robert's immediate protest. That's absurd. I wasn't even there that night. Tell them, Eleanor, tell them I arrived after Victoria's accident. Eleanor's face had gone completely white. Robert, don't. Tell them, Robert insisted, desperation edging into his voice. But it was Victoria who spoke next, her raspy voice growing marginally stronger with each word. Eleanor saw. She witnessed everything. Jonathan turned to his sister, betrayal and disbelief warring in his expression. Eleanor? Eleanor seemed to collapse inward, the weight of 15 years of deception finally becoming too much to bear. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, she whispered. Victoria called me after your fight saying she'd discovered Robert was embezzling funds. She was gathering evidence to present to you and the board. So you warned Robert, Sullivan deduced, the investigator connecting the dots with practiced ease. Eleanor nodded miserably. I called him because I thought we could reason with Victoria, convince her to handle it quietly. My research was being funded through one of the accounts Robert had reallocated. I was afraid of losing everything if there was a scandal. When did you realize it wasn't just about the money? Jonathan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Eleanor couldn't meet his eyes. When Robert arrived at the house, he was different, angry in a way I'd never seen before. He and Victoria argued in the library. I tried to calm them both down, but then Victoria threatened to call you immediately. She was standing at the top of the stairs when Robert just lunged at her. It was an accident, Robert interjected desperately. I only meant to stop her from reaching the phone. I never intended for her to fall. Victoria's voice came again, weak but clear. Not accident. He said, no one would believe me. That you, her eyes found Jonathan's, would think I left because of our fight. Sullivan had moved silently to position himself directly behind Robert, who seemed to sense that his options were rapidly diminishing. What happened after Victoria fell? The detective asked Eleanor, his voice professionally calm despite the horrific story unfolding. I rushed down the stairs to help her, Eleanor replied, tears now flowing freely. She was unconscious, bleeding from a head wound. My medical training took over. I stabilized her while Robert panicked, saying we needed to cover it up, that no one would believe it was an accident given the financial discoveries Victoria had made. So you brought her down here, Jonathan said, the pieces finally falling into place. To this secret medical room you'd been preparing for your research. Eleanor nodded. It seemed like the only option in that moment. I convinced myself I was saving her life, that a hospital wouldn't be able to respond quickly enough to her traumatic brain injury. But then when she didn't regain consciousness in those first critical days, you and Robert created the narrative of her voluntary departure, Sullivan finished. Robert handled the details, Eleanor admitted. He packed a suitcase with her clothes, took her passport and credit cards, made it look like she'd fled after your argument. Robert's calculated charm had completely evaporated, replaced by the cornered desperation of a man seeing his carefully constructed world collapsing. It was never supposed to be permanent, he insisted, just until we could figure out a better solution. And then days turned into weeks, weeks into months, Eleanor continued, unable to stop the flood of truth now that the dam had broken. Victoria's condition stabilized but showed no signs of improvement. The longer we maintained the deception, the harder it became to imagine a way out that wouldn't destroy everyone involved. So you just continued, Jonathan said, the horror of it all evident in his voice. For 15 years. I told myself I was doing what was best for everyone, Eleanor replied, her voice small. That my research might eventually help Victoria recover. That you were better off building a new life rather than being chained to a bedside with no hope of recovery. Victoria's hand tightened around Jonathan's again, drawing his attention back to her. Her eyes were clearer now, more focused, as if each moment of consciousness was strengthening her connection to the world around her. Not your decision, she whispered, the rebuke gentle but unmistakable. No, Eleanor agreed, finally meeting Victoria's gaze directly. It wasn't, and I am so sorry. Sullivan had moved to stand directly behind Robert, whose eyes were darting around the room as if searching for escape. Robert Miller, the detective began formally. I may be retired, but I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for the assault of Victoria Blackwood and the subsequent conspiracy to conceal your actions. How you can't prove anything, Robert blustered, though his voice lacked conviction. It's been 15 years, there's no evidence besides the word of a woman with severe brain damage and a confessed conspirator trying to save herself. Actually, Jonathan interjected, Victoria's hidden documents include financial records showing your embezzlement patterns. That establishes motive. And I suspect when the authorities search this facility, they'll find Eleanor kept detailed medical records documenting Victoria's original injuries, which will likely be consistent with a fall or a push down the library stairs. Eleanor nodded slowly. I kept everything. Medical ethics required thorough documentation even if, she faltered, even if what we did was unethical in other ways. Robert made a sudden move toward the door, but Sullivan, despite his years in retirement, reacted with the instincts of a career lawman. He stepped smoothly into Robert's path, his stance making it clear that the younger man wouldn't be leaving the room. Don't make this worse for yourself, Sullivan advised calmly. The truth has a way of coming out, no matter how deeply it's buried. As if in response to his words, Victoria's voice came again, stronger than before. Truth always finds a way. Sophia smiled at Victoria, still holding her hand. That's what you kept telling me, that the truth needed to be found, that it was trapped, like you were. For the first time, Victoria managed to turn her head slightly, focusing fully on the child beside her. How did you hear me? Emma stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Sophia's shoulder. Sophia has always had a special sensitivity, the social worker explained. Her case files are full of incidents that her previous foster families couldn't explain. Knowing things she shouldn't know, finding things that were lost, sometimes even responding to thoughts no one had spoken aloud. I just hear people sometimes, Sophia explained with a child's simple acceptance of her own uniqueness. Usually when they're really sad or scared or lost, your voice was the loudest I ever heard, like you were shouting but nobody else could hear you. Victoria's eyes filled with tears that spilled slowly down her cheeks. Thank you for listening. What happens now? Eleanor asked, her voice small and uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident doctor who had been so sure of her righteous deception just hours before. Sullivan answered, his tone leaving no room for debate. Now I call the authorities. This situation goes well beyond what can be handled privately. Victoria needs proper medical evaluation, Eleanor protested weakly. Moving her could be dangerous in her condition. A full medical team will be brought in, Sullivan assured her. But this facility is now a potential crime scene. Nothing leaves this room until investigators have documented everything. As Sullivan moved toward the stairs to find better cell reception, Robert made one last desperate appeal. Jonathan, be reasonable. Think of the scandal this will create. Your company's stock will plummet. Your reputation... Stop. Jonathan's voice cut through Robert's plea like a blade. For 15 years, I've lived with the pain of believing my wife abandoned me. I've built a fortune, yes, but I've lived half a life. No company, no reputation, no amount of money is worth more than the truth Victoria deserves. Victoria's eyes hadn't left Jonathan's face. Despite her weakened state, her gaze held a clarity and intensity that transcended her physical condition. John, she whispered, still love you. The simple declaration broke something open in Jonathan's chest, a dam holding back 15 years of suppressed grief and longing. Tears flowed freely down his face as he leaned closer to his wife. I never stopped loving you, Victoria, not for a single day. Sophia released Victoria's hand and stepped back, a wisdom beyond her years evident in her solemn expression. She needs you now, the child said simply, more than she needs me. Chapter 6. The Road to Recovery. 3 months passed in a whirlwind of medical evaluations, legal proceedings, and media scrutiny. Hawthorne Manor, once shrouded in dusty silence, now bustled with activity as Victoria's recovery became the center of Jonathan's world. The grand ballroom on the first floor had been transformed into a state-of-the-art rehabilitation facility, allowing Victoria to remain at home while receiving the specialized care she needed. Physical therapists, speech pathologists, and neurologists came and went daily, each contributing to what medical journals were already calling a miraculous recovery. Jonathan sat in the sunroom adjacent to the ballroom, watching as Victoria worked through her afternoon physical therapy session. Though still confined to a wheelchair for longer movements, she was now able to take supported steps and had regained significant control of her fine motor skills. Her speech, initially halting and slurred, had improved dramatically, though she still tired easily during longer conversations. She's making remarkable progress, Dr. Samantha Chen observed, joining Jonathan by the window. The neurologist had been overseeing Victoria's case since she was transferred from Eleanor's underground facility. Her determination is extraordinary. Jonathan nodded, his eyes never leaving his wife as she carefully grasped and released colored blocks under the therapist's guidance. Victoria was always the strongest person I knew, even before. He didn't need to finish the sentence. The events surrounding Victoria's injury and 15-year confinement had become national news, despite their best efforts to maintain privacy. Robert Miller was currently awaiting trial for assault and conspiracy charges, having been denied bail due to significant flight risk. The financial crimes had been more difficult to prosecute after so many years, but the SEC investigation into his embezzlement scheme continued to uncover new evidence. Eleanor's situation was more complicated. Her actions after Victoria's injury, the medical care she had provided, the detailed records she had kept, suggested a genuine, if terribly misguided, attempt to help. But her participation in the deception, her willingness to let Jonathan believe his wife had abandoned him, could not be so easily forgiven. Have you spoken with your sister recently? Dr. Chen asked, seemingly reading Jonathan's thoughts. Not since last week's deposition, he admitted. The prosecutors are still determining what charges she'll face. Eleanor had surrendered her medical license voluntarily while the investigation proceeded. She now lived in a small apartment in downtown Newport, cooperating fully with authorities and providing crucial testimony against Robert. Victoria asks about her sometimes, Dr. Chen noted carefully. There seems to be less anger there than one might expect. Jonathan sighed, running a hand through hair that had gained more silver streaks in the past 3 months. Victoria has always been better at forgiveness than I am. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma Bennett, who entered the sunroom with Sophia skipping alongside her. The child's face lit up at the sight of Victoria, and she immediately hurried to the therapy area to greet her. "How are things progressing with the guardianship application?" Dr. Chen asked quietly, as they watched Sophia show Victoria a drawing she had made. "The courts are being thorough, as they should be," Jonathan replied. "But Emma has been incredibly helpful with the process. Her recommendation carries significant weight." After the truth about Victoria had come to light, Jonathan had been unwilling to let Sophia return to the foster system that had failed her so many times before. The child's inexplicable connection to Victoria, which neurologists and parapsychologists alike had been unable to fully explain, had created a bond that neither time nor scientific skepticism could diminish. Emma joined them by the window, her professional demeanor softened by a genuine smile. "Sophia has been counting the days until this visit," she said. "She's drawn pictures of Victoria every day this week." "We've missed her too," Jonathan acknowledged. When Sophia had been temporarily placed in a foster home during the initial investigations, Victoria had insisted on daily video calls with the child, her concern for Sophia's well-being seemingly as important as her own recovery. "The home study went well yesterday," Emma informed him. "The social worker was impressed with the accommodations you've prepared, and your background check has cleared all requirements. If the court appearance next week goes as expected, Sophia could be placed with you permanently by the end of the month." Jonathan felt a surge of gratitude. "We couldn't have navigated this process without your support, Emma." The social worker's expression grew more serious. "Sophia deserves stability and love. After everything she did to help Victoria, I'm just glad I could play a part in helping her find a permanent home." Across the room, Victoria had finished her therapy session and was now sitting in her wheelchair with Sophia perched on a stool beside her. The child was showing Victoria her school notebook, proudly pointing out the gold stars her teacher had awarded her work. "She's doing well in school?" Jonathan asked. Emma nodded. "Remarkably well, considering how disrupted her education has been. Her foster mother says she's reading at nearly 2 grade levels above her age, and her ability to concentrate has improved significantly since—" She hesitated. "Since she stopped hearing Victoria's voice in her head." The phenomenon that had brought Sophia to Hawthorne Manor still defied conventional explanation. Several research universities had requested permission to study the child's apparent psychic abilities, but Jonathan and Emma had firmly declined, prioritizing Sophia's need for normalcy over scientific curiosity. "She says the voices are usually quiet now," Emma continued, though she mentioned last week that she sometimes still feels echoes from Victoria. Not words exactly, but emotions. Dr. Chen's professional interest was evident, though she respected the boundaries that had been established regarding Sophia's unique abilities. The connection between them remains fascinating. In my 30 years of neurological practice, I've encountered several cases where coma patients reported awareness during their unconscious state, but never one where they successfully communicated with an outside individual, especially a child with no prior connection to them. Victoria says they were meant to find each other, Jonathan said simply. After everything he had witnessed, he was no longer quick to dismiss possibilities that fell outside conventional understanding. The sunroom door opened again, and Sullivan entered, his casual clothes a reminder that he remained officially retired, despite his ongoing involvement in the case. The former detective had become a frequent visitor to Hawthorne Manor, his initial professional interest evolving into genuine friendship with Jonathan and Victoria. "Good news," he announced without preamble. "The DA is offering Eleanor a plea deal. No prison time if she cooperates fully in Robert's prosecution and accepts 5 years of probation plus community service." Jonathan's expression remained guarded. "And her medical license?" "Suspended for 5 years, with the possibility of reinstatement after review," Sullivan replied. "Given the circumstances, it's more lenient than many expected." "Victoria will be relieved," Jonathan acknowledged. Despite everything, his wife had advocated for leniency toward Eleanor, arguing that her sister-in-law's actions, however misguided, had stemmed from a genuine desire to provide the best medical care possible under impossible circumstances. Sullivan moved closer, lowering his voice. "There's something else you should know." The investigators found additional research notes in Eleanor's apartment, studies on experimental compounds she was developing specifically for Victoria's condition. Preliminary review suggests she may have been onto something significant. Several pharmaceutical companies have already expressed interest in continuing her work. "Does Eleanor know?" Sullivan nodded. "She's been offered a non-clinical research position at Stanford, effective after her case is resolved. No direct patient care, but full laboratory resources to continue her work under proper oversight." Jonathan absorbed this information in silence, his feelings toward his sister still too complex to easily categorize. The anger remained, a simmering sense of betrayal that 15 years of his and Victoria's lives had been stolen, but beneath it lay the uncomfortable recognition that Eleanor's unorthodox treatments might have preserved neural pathways that conventional medicine would have considered beyond recovery. Across the room, Victoria had noticed Sullivan's arrival and was gesturing for him to join her and Sophia. As the former detective moved to greet them, Dr. Chen excused herself to review therapy notes, leaving Jonathan and Emma alone by the window. "How are you holding up through all this?" Emma asked, her professional insight allowing her to see beyond Jonathan's carefully maintained composure. He considered the question seriously before answering. "Some days are easier than others. There's joy in having Victoria back, in seeing her progress each day. But then I remember the 15 years we lost, and it's hard not to be consumed by anger." Emma nodded, understanding. "That's a normal response to trauma and loss. Both you and Victoria have experienced profound grief, albeit in different ways. Healing isn't linear." "Victoria says we need to focus on the time we have now, not the time we lost," Jonathan said, a hint of wonder in his voice. "After everything she endured, she's the one comforting me." "She had 15 years to process what happened," Emma pointed out gently. "While her body was immobile, her mind was working through the trauma, at least on some level. You're still catching up." Jonathan watched as Victoria laughed at something Sophia had said, the sound still the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. "Some days it feels like a dream, finding her, bringing her home, watching her grow stronger. I'm afraid I'll wake up back in my San Francisco apartment, alone with just the memories of what might have been." "That's not uncommon after traumatic reunions," Emma assured him. "The sense of unreality can persist for months, even years, but each day that passes makes the new reality more concrete." Their conversation was interrupted when Victoria began wheeling herself toward them, Sophia walking proudly beside the chair, one hand resting lightly on the armrest. Sullivan followed a few steps behind, his weathered face softened by a smile. "Jonathan," Victoria called, her voice stronger than it had been even a week ago, "Sophia has wonderful news." The child beamed, practically bouncing with excitement. "I got the lead in the school play. I'm going to be Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz." "That's fantastic, Sophia," Jonathan congratulated her, genuinely pleased. The normalcy of the achievement, a school play, a proud moment in a child's life, stood in stark contrast to the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them all together. "The performance is next month," Sophia continued eagerly. "Miss, Emma says you can both come if everything goes well with the judge next week." The hesitation in her voice revealed the lingering uncertainty she felt about her future, a vulnerability that all the adults in the room recognized from their different professional and personal perspectives. Victoria reached out to take Sophia's hand. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," she promised, the certainty in her voice offering the reassurance the child needed. "Dorothy is the perfect role for you, a brave girl who helps others find their way home." The parallels weren't lost on anyone. Sophia had, in her own way, helped Victoria find her way home after 15 years of disconnection. And now, if the courts approved, Hawthorne Manor would become Sophia's home as well, completing a circle that had begun with a child hearing whispers that no one else could hear. "Why don't you show Jonathan the costume design you drew?" Victoria suggested, and Sophia hurried back to retrieve her notebook. Once the child was out of earshot, Victoria turned to Emma. "Have there been any issues with the previous foster families?" Any objections to our petition? Emma shook her head. None. The current placement was always intended to be temporary, and your resources for providing a stable home environment are undeniable. It's not about our resources, Victoria corrected gently. It's about giving her the belonging she's never had. Sullivan, who had remained tactfully quiet during the guardianship discussion, checked his watch. I should head out. I'm meeting with the prosecutor again this afternoon to go over my testimony for Robert's trial. Any updates on when that might begin? Jonathan asked. The defense keeps filing motions for delay, but the judge seems determined to move forward. Jury selection should start next month, Sullivan replied. Are you both still committed to testifying? Victoria nodded firmly. Absolutely. The truth needs to be heard. All of it. As Sullivan took his leave, Sophia returned with her notebook, proudly displaying a colourful drawing of Dorothy's iconic blue gingham dress and ruby slippers. While Jonathan admired her artwork, Victoria exchanged a meaningful look with Emma. I'd like to visit Eleanor, Victoria said quietly when Sophia was distracted. Before the plea deal is finalized. Emma's surprise was evident. Are you sure you're ready for that? Victoria's expression was resolute. No, but it's necessary for both of us. Jonathan overheard and turned toward his wife, concern evident in his face. Victoria, you don't owe Eleanor anything. After what she did... It's not about owing, Victoria interrupted gently. It's about moving forward. I spent 15 years trapped in darkness, Jonathan. I won't spend the rest of my life trapped by anger and resentment. The quiet strength in her voice silenced any further objections. Despite the medical ordeal she had endured, despite the betrayal by family members she had trusted, Victoria remained unbroken, changed certainly, but not diminished. Dr. Chen, who had been observing from a professional distance, approached with Victoria's medication schedule. You should rest before your speech therapy session, she advised. You've already exceeded the recommended activity level for today. Victoria acknowledged this with a graceful nod, though Jonathan recognized the flicker of frustration that crossed her face. For someone who had been completely immobilized for 15 years, even the gentlest limitations on her recovery activities felt like constraints. Sophia, Emma called, we should let Victoria rest. We can come back this weekend for a longer visit. The child's disappointment was evident, but she nodded with surprising maturity. Can I come say goodbye first? At Victoria's nod, Sophia approached the wheelchair and carefully hugged the woman, who had somehow called to her across barriers that science couldn't fully explain. I'll bring you more pictures on Saturday, she promised. I'll be looking forward to it, Victoria assured her, smoothing the child's hair with a tenderness that made Jonathan's heart constrict. As Emma and Sophia prepared to leave, Jonathan walked them to the door, engaging in quiet conversation about the upcoming court date, while Dr. Chen helped Victoria begin her journey back to the master suite, now relocated to the ground floor to accommodate her recovery needs. She's remarkable, Emma observed, watching Victoria's dignified progress down the hallway, despite the wheelchair she still required. The neurologists I've spoken with can't believe the speed of her recovery. Victoria has always defied expectations, Jonathan replied, a note of pride cutting through the weariness in his voice. Even before all this. Sophia tugged at Emma's hand. Can I ask something important? When Emma nodded encouragement, the child looked up at Jonathan with solemn eyes. If the judge says it's okay for me to live here, would it be all right if I called Victoria Mom someday? Not right away, she added hastily, but when it feels right. The question, so innocent, yet so profound, momentarily robbed Jonathan of speech. He knelt down to Sophia's eye level, finding himself face to face with the child who had irrevocably changed the course of so many lives. Sophia, he said gently, I think that would make Victoria very happy. And it would make me very happy, too. The child's face broke into a radiant smile. I've never had a real mum before, or a dad, she added, with a meaningful look that made Jonathan's eyes sting with sudden emotion. We'll talk about all of that after next week's court date, Emma interjected, practical as always. One step at a time, remember? As they said their goodbyes, Jonathan watched Sophia skip toward Emma's car, the resilience of childhood evident in her buoyant steps. Despite everything the child had endured in her short life, the instability of the foster system, the confusion of abilities she couldn't explain, the burden of carrying Victoria's silent pleas, she remained fundamentally hopeful, open to the possibility of happiness. In that moment, Jonathan recognized that Sophia had given him and Victoria something beyond the miracle of reunion. She had given them a future to look forward to, a reason to focus on what lay ahead rather than the years that had been lost. He returned to the manor to find Victoria in their bedroom, already changed into comfortable clothes for her rest period. Dr. Chen had discreetly withdrawn to the adjacent monitoring room, giving them privacy while remaining within call if needed. "She asked if she could call you Mom someday," Jonathan said without preamble, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "What did you tell her?" "That I thought you'd like that very much." "I would." Victoria reached for his hand, her grip stronger than it had been even a week ago. "She's given us so much, Jonathan, a second chance, a new beginning." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "Rest now. The speech therapist will be here in 2 hours." Victoria settled back against the pillows, but her mind was clearly still active. "I meant what I said about visiting Eleanor." Jonathan sighed, knowing better than to argue once Victoria had made up her mind about something, a trait that 15 years in a coma hadn't diminished. "I'll arrange it, but only when Dr. Chen says you're strong enough." Victoria's eyes were already beginning to drift closed, her body's need for rest asserting itself despite her determined spirit. "Promise me something," she murmured sleepily. "Anything." "Promise me we won't waste a single day of whatever time we have left together." Jonathan felt the weight and wonder of those words, the miracle of having his wife return to him after 15 years, the precious uncertainty of the future, the gift of each moment they now shared. "I promise," he whispered, as Victoria's breathing deepened into sleep. "Not a single day." Chapter 7. Full Circle. 1 year later. The grand library of Hawthorne Manor bore little resemblance to the dust-shrouded tomb Jonathan had first re-entered 16 months ago. Sunlight streamed through the newly restored stained glass windows, casting jewel-toned patterns across gleaming hardwood floors. The once gloomy space had been transformed into a bright, welcoming environment where the dark memories of the past could no longer take root. Victoria stood by the bay windows, one hand resting lightly on a decorative cane she used more from medical caution than necessity these days. Her recovery had progressed beyond what even the most optimistic specialists had predicted. Though she still tired more easily than before her injury, and occasionally struggled with complex sentences when fatigued, she had regained nearly all her physical capabilities and cognitive functions. "The first guest should be arriving soon," Jonathan said, joining his wife by the window. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Victoria turned to him with a smile that still made his heart skip, even after 20 years of marriage, 15 of which had been spent in separation. "I'm not just up for it. I'm looking forward to it. This house has been silent for too long." They had spent months debating what to do with the mansion after Victoria's recovery. Initially, Jonathan had suggested selling it, wanting to leave behind the physical space that held so many painful memories. But Victoria had surprised him by advocating to keep Hawthorne Manor, to transform it rather than abandon it. "Places aren't inherently good or evil," she had argued during her rehabilitation. "It's what happens in them that gives them their character. This house was my prison, yes, but now it can be something else entirely, something healing and hopeful." And so they had embarked on an ambitious renovation project, completely reimagining the mansion's interior while preserving its historic exterior. The hidden medical room beneath the library had been sealed permanently, but not before Eleanor's research notes and equipment had been carefully documented and transferred to the Neurological Research Foundation Victoria had established. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Sophia's arrival before she appeared in the doorway, resplendent in a new blue dress chosen specifically for today's event. "Mom, Dad, is my hair okay?" The 10-year-old spun around to show off the intricate braid Victoria had woven earlier that morning, now adorned with small blue flowers that matched her dress. "You look perfect, sweetheart," Victoria assured her, extending an arm to draw the child close. The adoption had been finalized 6 months ago, though in truth Sophia had become their daughter in every meaningful way long before the legal proceedings were complete. The bright, intuitive child who had once heard whispers no one else could hear had blossomed under their care, her academic abilities matching her emotional intelligence. Her psychic experiences hadn't disappeared entirely. Occasionally, she still sensed things others couldn't, knew things she shouldn't be able to know. But as she grew more secure in her new family, these episodes had become less frequent and less intense. The child psychologist who had been monitoring her development suggested that perhaps Sophia's extraordinary sensitivity had been heightened by her own emotional needs, creating a unique receptivity to Victoria's desperate attempts to communicate. "Is Aunt Eleanor coming today?" Sophia asked, straightening a pile of brochures on the nearby table. Jonathan and Victoria exchanged a glance before Victoria answered, "Yes, she'll be here. She's bringing some colleagues from the Research Institute." The relationship between Jonathan and his sister remained complicated. Forgiveness was a journey rather than a destination, but significant healing had occurred over the past year. Eleanor had completed her plea agreement and now worked full-time at the Victoria Blackwood Neurological Research Institute, where her unconventional theories about consciousness in coma patients were finally receiving the rigorous scientific scrutiny they deserved. Victoria's case study, published in several prestigious medical journals, had sparked renewed interest in the field and attracted substantial funding for further research. What Eleanor had begun in secrecy and ethical compromise was now continuing in the open, potentially benefiting countless future patients. "The caterers are all set up in the dining room," Sullivan announced, appearing in the doorway. Though still officially retired, the former detective had accepted a position as security consultant for both the Blackwood family and the newly established foundation. "And the presentation equipment?" Jonathan asked. "All tested and working perfectly," Sullivan confirmed with a nod. "Emma's handling the final arrangements for the press area." Emma Bennett, who had transitioned from being Sophia's social worker to becoming the foundation's community outreach director, had proven invaluable in organizing today's event. Her practical experience with vulnerable populations informed the foundation's mission in ways that pure medical research could not. A car crunched on the gravel driveway outside, signaling the arrival of the first guests. Victoria took a deep breath, squeezing Jonathan's hand. "It's really happening," she said softly. "Second thoughts?" he asked, searching her face. She shook her head firmly. "Not a single one. This is exactly where we should be, exactly what we should be doing." What they were doing, what today's event would officially launch, was the transformation of Hawthorne Manor's East Wing into the country's first specialized residential facility for children recovering from traumatic brain injuries. The program would combine cutting-edge medical care with educational support, all within an environment designed to feel like a home rather than a hospital. "Sophia, would you please show Dr. Chen and her team to the presentation area?" Victoria asked as their first guests emerged from a university van. The child nodded importantly, always eager to help with foundation activities. Her personal experience with Victoria's recovery had sparked an interest in medicine that her parents were carefully nurturing, along with her natural empathy for others facing challenges. As Sophia headed outside, Victoria turned back to Jonathan. "I keep thinking about that day, the day you finally came back to the manor. How different everything might have been if you'd chosen not to listen to a strange child's story." "I almost didn't," Jonathan admitted, the memory still sobering. "If Sullivan hadn't convinced me to at least check it out," Victoria touched his cheek gently. "But you did come, and here we are." "Here we are," he agreed, the simple phrase encompassing a journey too profound for more elaborate expression. The sound of more arriving vehicles drew them toward the entrance hall, where they would greet the mix of medical professionals, potential donors, and media representatives who had been invited to the foundation's launch. "Victoria." A familiar voice spoke from the library doorway. They turned to find Eleanor standing there, elegantly dressed but visibly nervous, a leather portfolio clutched in her hands, though she had been involved in the Foundation's planning from the beginning. Her interactions with Jonathan remained tentative, laden with the weight of past choices. Victoria smiled warmly, extending her hand. "Eleanor, I'm so glad you could make it." "I wouldn't have missed it," Eleanor replied, accepting the offered hand. "The research team is very excited about the presentation." Jonathan nodded formally to his sister. Their relationship had thawed considerably since the early days after Victoria's awakening, but a certain reserve remained, perhaps always would. "Are the clinical trial results ready?" Eleanor nodded, patting the portfolio. "Preliminary data? From the first 30 patients, the results are promising." The experimental treatment protocol that Eleanor had developed for Victoria, refined and properly tested over the past year, was showing significant potential for patients previously considered to have minimal chances of recovery. What had begun as a desperate, ethically compromised attempt to help one woman might ultimately benefit countless others. "Dr. Blackwood," Sophia's voice carried from the entrance hall, "the university team needs you for the technical setup." Eleanor smiled at the formality of her niece's address, a compromise they had reached months ago when Aunt Eleanor felt too familiar, but Ms. Blackwood too distant. "Duty calls," she said, moving toward the door. As she passed Jonathan, she paused briefly. "I know I've said it before, but I am truly sorry for the years I stole from you both. Not a day passes that I don't regret the choices I made." Jonathan's expression softened slightly. "We're trying to create something meaningful from what happened. That's what matters now." It wasn't quite forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, recognition, that the path forward lay through purpose rather than recrimination. Eleanor nodded understanding before continuing toward the entrance hall. Left alone momentarily in the library, Jonathan and Victoria stood in the spot where, 16 months ago, a secret passage had been revealed behind the bookshelf. That opening had now been permanently sealed, the bookshelf itself replaced with an elegant display case containing photographs, documents, and mementos chronicling Victoria's remarkable recovery. "There will be questions about it all," Victoria said, nodding toward the display. "The media will want the sensational details. The secret room, Robert's betrayal, Eleanor's deception, and Sophia's unexplainable connection to you," Jonathan added. "That's the part they seem most fascinated by." Victoria smiled. "Some things defy scientific explanation. I think that's what makes them uncomfortable. And yet, it's the foundation of the work we're doing now," Jonathan observed, "challenging conventional wisdom about consciousness, awareness, and recovery." The sound of many voices from the entrance hall signaled the arrival of more guests. Victoria straightened her shoulders and checked her reflection in the window glass, a habit formed during months of physical therapy when every small movement represented a victory over her condition. "Ready to change how the world thinks about brain injuries?" Jonathan asked, offering his arm. Victoria took it, her grip strong and certain. "More than ready. It's why I fought so hard to come back." Together they moved toward the entrance hall, where Sophia was already enthusiastically greeting guests, with the poise of a child secure in her place in the world. Emma stood nearby, clipboard in hand, directing arrivals to the appropriate areas. Sullivan maintained a watchful presence by the main door, his experienced eyes missing nothing. The gathering represented a perfect circle of connection, those who had been part of Victoria's discovery and recovery now united in extending that possibility to others. What had begun with a child hearing impossible whispers had transformed into a mission that would touch countless lives. As Jonathan and Victoria joined the welcoming party, a reporter approached them, recorder in hand. "Mrs. Blackwood, you say your experience has changed your perspective on what's possible in neurological recovery?" Victoria smiled, the warmth in her eyes undimmed by the challenges she had overcome. "What I learned during my 15 years of silence is that consciousness persists even when all outward signs suggest otherwise. We're not just launching a foundation today, we're challenging a fundamental assumption about human awareness." "And the little girl who heard you when no one else could?" the reporter pressed. "How do you explain that?" Victoria glanced across the room where Sophia was earnestly explaining the Foundation's logo to an elderly donor. "Some connections transcend our current understanding," she said simply. "That doesn't make them any less real." The reporter seemed about to ask another question when Eleanor approached, accompanied by a team of researchers. "Victoria, could we steal you for a moment? Dr. Patel has some questions about your sensory experiences during the early recovery phase." With an apologetic smile to the reporter, Victoria moved away with the research team, her passion for the work evident in her animated expressions as she engaged in detailed discussion of neural pathways and consciousness mapping. Jonathan watched his wife with undisguised admiration. The woman who had spent 15 years trapped in silence had emerged with a mission and a voice that grew stronger each day. The trauma had changed her, certainly, but in many ways it had distilled rather than diminished her essential nature, her compassion, her determination, her capacity for forgiveness. Sophia appeared at his side, slipping her small hand into his. "Is Mom doing okay? She's been talking a lot." "She's pacing herself," Jonathan assured her, touched by the child's protective instincts toward her adoptive mother. "But thank you for watching out for her." Sophia nodded seriously. "Dr. Chen said we should all pay attention to signs of fatigue, especially on big days like today." "You're going to make an excellent doctor someday," Jonathan observed, seeing in this precocious 10-year-old glimpses of the remarkable woman she would become. Sophia considered this thoughtfully. "Maybe. Or maybe a researcher like Aunt Eleanor. I want to understand why I could hear Mom when nobody else could." "Some mysteries might not have scientific explanations," Jonathan suggested gently. "Everything has an explanation," Sophia replied, with the certainty of childhood. "We just haven't figured it all out yet." Jonathan smiled at her confidence, recognizing in it echoes of both Victoria's quiet determination and Eleanor's scientific curiosity. This child, who had come into their lives through such extraordinary circumstances, was developing an identity uniquely her own, shaped by her experiences but not defined by them. As the gathering moved toward the presentation area for the formal launch of the Foundation, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the dust-covered silence of an abandoned mansion to the vibrant purpose that now filled these rooms, from devastating loss to unexpected joy, from isolation to community. Victoria caught his eye across the room and smiled. That particular smile that had always been only for him. In it he saw acknowledgement of all they had endured and celebration of all they had reclaimed. Most of all he saw promise, the promise of days still to come, moments still to be shared, love still to be expressed. 15 years had been taken from them, but the life they were building now, with Sophia, with the Foundation, with each other, was richer for having been so nearly lost. That was the ultimate triumph over the tragedy they had endured, not merely surviving it, but transforming it into something meaningful that would touch other lives for generations to come. As Victoria stepped to the podium to formally open the Victoria Blackwood Foundation for Neurological Recovery, her voice rang clear and strong through the room, a voice that had once been silenced, but would never be silenced again. "Welcome to Hawthorne Manor," she began, her gaze finding Jonathan and Sophia in the audience. "A place where whispers become voices, where silence becomes speech, where what seems lost can be found again." In that moment, surrounded by people dedicated to extending to others the second chance they had been given, Jonathan knew with absolute certainty they had come full circle. The mansion that had been a prison had become a place of liberation. The tragedy that had nearly destroyed them had become the foundation of new purpose.